The city was on fire. The sky, once filled with shining stars, now glowed red with smoke and destruction. Explosions shook the ground, and alien ships hovered like silent predators, their searchlights sweeping over the ruins. Deep within the shattered remains of what had once been a marketplace, Jared Carter, a human soldier, crouched behind a collapsed building. His hands gripped his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't signed up for this. He was supposed to be a peacekeeper, a simple security officer assigned to Vekri, for a trading colony where humans and alien species coexisted. But everything had changed overnight. The Tark'eth Empire, a ruthless alien race, had invaded without warning. The city was overrun. The human settlement was destroyed. Most civilians had been captured or killed. Jared had managed to escape with a small group of survivors, but they were scattered now. Alone, exhausted, and running out of supplies, he had one goal: find a safe place before the Tark'eth patrols found him first. But then, he saw her. She was sitting in the middle of the street, trembling in the cold. A young alien girl, barely more than a teenager, with pale blue skin and dark violet eyes. She was covered in dust, her clothes torn, her arms wrapped around herself as she rocked back and forth. She was crying. No one else was around. No humans. No Tark'eth soldiers. Just her, alone in the ruins, her quiet sobs barely audible over the distant gunfire. Jared's instincts screamed at him to keep moving. She wasn't his problem. He had no weapons to spare. No food. No way to help. But something in his chest tightened. Why was she alone? Where was her family? Had she lost them to the attack? He clenched his jaw. It didn't matter. He had to stay alive. But just as he turned away, she lifted her head. Her eyes locked onto his, wide with fear and hope. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. Jared cursed under his breath. He knew that look. The look of someone who had lost everything. And no matter how dangerous this war had become, no matter how much survival demanded he think only of himself, he couldn't ignore her. Slowly, he stepped forward. The girl flinched, pressing her back against the wall, as if expecting him to hurt her. He stopped a few feet away and lowered his rifle. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Jared hesitated. Did she even understand him? Her species, he wasn't sure what they were called, wasn't native to this planet. But they had been traders, scholars, and diplomats. He had seen them before in the market, speaking fluent Standard Galactic. He tried again, softer this time. "Are you hurt?" She blinked, then slowly shook her head. Jared exhaled. "Good. That meant she could move." "We need to go," he said, glancing over his shoulder. The Tark'eth patrols could be anywhere. He didn't have time for this. But the girl didn't move. Her shoulders shook, and more tears silently slipped down her cheeks. She was in shock. Probably hadn't eaten in days. Probably hadn't slept either. Jared ran a hand through his short, dirt-covered hair. This was a bad idea. A really bad idea. But he couldn't leave her here. He sighed, then pulled the emergency ration bar from his pocket and crouched down, holding it out. Her eyes widened. Her fingers hesitated before taking it. She sniffled, whispered something in a language he didn't understand, then took a small bite. Jared looked around again. They couldn't stay here. More explosions rumbled in the distance. The Tark'eth were still hunting survivors. He stood up. "We have to move." The girl hesitated but nodded. She struggled to her feet, her legs weak and shaky. Jared took a deep breath. He was alone. He was unarmed except for one rifle. And now, he had a frightened alien girl to protect. This war had already taken everything from both of them. But as he watched her try to stand tall despite her trembling hands, Jared knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving her behind. The night was cold, but the silence was worse. Jared led the alien girl through the ruins, his steps careful, his eyes scanning every shadow. Smoke curled in the distance, carrying the scent of burning metal and something far worse. Somewhere beyond the broken buildings, the Tark'eth were still hunting. The girl followed without a sound. That was good. It meant she understood, one noise could get them both killed. Jared didn't know what he was doing. He had no plan, no safe house, and barely any supplies. His squad was either dead or missing. His comms were useless, jammed by the invaders. And yet, instead of focusing on survival, he had picked up a stray. He glanced back at her. She was too small, too fragile-looking to belong in a war zone. Her pale blue skin had bruises, her violet eyes still red from crying. She hugged herself as she walked, shivering from the cold. Jared gritted his teeth. He had one spare thermal pack. He needed it. But she needed it more. Without stopping, he pulled it from his belt, cracked it to activate the heat, and tossed it back to her. She caught it, blinking at him in surprise. "Hold it close," he muttered. She hesitated before pressing it to her chest. For the first time, her expression softened. Jared turned back ahead. They had to keep moving. Then, the sound came. A low, guttural clicking from the alleyway to their left. Jared's instincts screamed. Tark'eth patrol. He grabbed the girl and shoved her behind a fallen column. She gasped but stayed quiet. Good. She learned fast. He pressed himself against the rubble and gripped his rifle. His breath slowed. His pulse hammered. The clicking sound grew closer. Jared risked a peek. A Tark'eth soldier stood at the alley's entrance, scanning the area with its 4 beady black eyes. The creature's exoskeleton glistened under the firelit sky, its clawed hands gripping a plasma rifle. Jared held his breath. One wrong move, and they were dead. The Tark'eth warrior sniffed the air, clicking its mandibles. It knew someone was here. The alien girl trembled beside him. Her small hands clutched the heat pack like it was the last warmth in the universe. Jared's mind raced. If it came closer, he'd have to take it out fast, one shot to the head, no mistakes. His fingers tightened on the trigger. Wait. The Tark'eth took a slow step forward. Jared could see the energy building in its rifle. Another step. Just one more. The girl beside him suddenly stiffened. Before Jared could stop her, she moved. She did the last thing he expected. She reached out and grabbed a broken glass shard from the ground. Then, before Jared could react, she threw it. The shard clinked against a metal scrap heap further down the road. The Tark'eth immediately snapped its head toward the sound. Jared didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged up from cover, aimed his rifle, and fired. The Tark'eth warrior collapsed, blue blood splattering against the rubble. Jared's breath came hard and fast. The girl beside him was frozen, staring at the dead alien. She had saved them. She had acted first. Jared slowly looked at her. She wasn't just some helpless stray. She was watching. Learning. And she wasn't afraid to fight back. The realization sent a chill down his spine. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. And this war wasn't over yet. The Tark'eth soldier's corpse hadn't even cooled before Jared grabbed the girl's wrist and pulled her into the shadows. We have to go. Now. She didn't argue. Good. She understood. Jared had seen enough war zones to know what came next. The Tark'eth weren't just hunters, they were like wolves. Kill one, and the rest came sniffing. And the girl had just thrown the first stone. The city was dying. Flames licked at the edges of collapsed buildings, painting the ruins in deep orange light. Ships howled overhead, their spotlights sweeping the streets like predators searching for prey. Jared pulled the girl into an abandoned store, its front wall shattered, its shelves overturned. He crouched near the broken glass, scanning the outside. The girl stood close behind him, gripping the heated pack with both hands. She was still shaking. He turned his head slightly. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered something in a language he didn't understand. Jared sighed. "Of course." She seemed to think for a moment before tapping her chest with her fingers. "Lyrian." Jared nodded. "Lyrian." At least now she wasn't just the girl. A sudden roar from the sky made them both freeze. Jared's stomach dropped. The hunt had begun. Tark'eth hunters were different. Regular soldiers patrolled, captured, and killed on orders. But the hunters? They didn't take prisoners. They didn't hesitate. They lived for the thrill of tracking the ones who fought back. And now, Jared and Lyrian were on their list. Jared peered through a crack in the broken wall. The street was empty, but he could hear movement. The clicking sound of claws scraping against metal. They were close. He turned to Lyrian and pressed a finger to his lips. "Stay silent." Her breath hitched, but she nodded. Outside, something moved. A shadow stretched across the street, tall, insect-like, moving unnaturally fast. Jared's muscles coiled. If they got spotted here, they were dead. He slowly, carefully reached for his knife. His rifle wouldn't help much in close quarters. Lyrian squeezed her heat pack tighter, her violet eyes wide. The shadow stopped. Jared held his breath. For a terrifying moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of distant fires. Then, the hunter laughed. A deep, wet, unnatural sound, like a predator who already knew how the chase would end. It spoke in broken galactic standard. "You run. We hunt. No escape." Jared's pulse pounded in his skull. They knew. They were being toyed with. Lyrian's fingers clenched at her sides. Jared saw the panic creeping in. He couldn't let her freeze up now. He had to move. Now. Then Jared did something insane. He grabbed a metal shard from the ground and hurled it across the street. It clattered against a broken signpost. The hunter immediately whipped around, claws raised. Jared didn't wait. He grabbed Lyrian's hand and ran. Through the back of the store. Through the rubble. Through the firelit ruins of a dying city. The hunter let out a piercing screech behind them. The chase was on. The night swallowed them whole. Jared dragged Lyrian through the ruins, his boots kicking up ash and debris. The air reeked of burning metal and something far worse, charred bodies, melted structures, the death of a city. Behind them, the hunter wasn't running. It was stalking. Jared knew that sound, the slow, deliberate steps, the clicks of claws scraping against stone. The Tark'eth hunter wasn't chasing them at full speed. It was playing with them. Jared gritted his teeth. That meant only one thing. They were already trapped. Lyrian stumbled. Her foot caught on a piece of broken pavement, and she hit the ground hard, gasping. Jared skidded to a stop. "Get up." She tried, but her legs were weak. Too cold. Too exhausted. Jared cursed under his breath. A distant, guttural laugh echoed through the wreckage. The hunter was closer now. Jared turned, his hands tight around his rifle. He couldn't see it yet, but he felt it watching. Lyrian looked up at him, her violet eyes shimmering with fear. But underneath that, something else. Shame. Jared exhaled. He wasn't going to leave her behind. He dropped to one knee and grabbed her shoulders. "Look at me," he whispered, urgent. "You survived this long. You are not weak." Lyrian's lip trembled. Jared's voice hardened. "I need you to move." She swallowed and nodded. Jared pulled her up, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun the hunter. They had to outthink it. The city was a graveyard of broken structures. But ahead, just barely visible in the firelight, stood an old transport tunnel. Underground. Jared's pulse quickened. If they could get inside, they could disappear. He turned to Lyrian. "Can you run?" She hesitated, then nodded again. Jared didn't waste another second. He grabbed her wrist. "Move." Then the hunter dropped from above. It slammed onto the pavement behind them, landing in a crouch. Its 4 beady eyes glowed in the firelight. It was twice Jared's size. Long, segmented arms. Serrated claws. A breathing apparatus that hissed with every inhale. But it didn't attack. It just tilted its head. Mocking them. Jared raised his rifle. He knew the truth. Bullets wouldn't kill this thing. Not unless he got a perfect headshot. And he wasn't feeling lucky. The hunter let out a clicking growl. Then it spoke. "Run." Jared fired first. The shot slammed into its shoulder, staggering it for a split second. Jared didn't wait to see if it recovered, he grabbed Lyrian and sprinted toward the tunnel. The hunter screeched in fury. Jared heard it move, too fast, too close. The tunnel entrance was only a few yards away. One mistake. One misstep. That was all it would take to die. And then, Lyrian did something insane. She twisted, grabbed Jared's belt, and threw herself backward. The sudden motion yanked him down just as the hunter's claw swiped where his head had been. It missed. Jared hit the ground hard, rolling onto his back. Lyrian scrambled beside him, gasping. The hunter snarled, its breathing ragged, its claws trembling with rage. For the first time, it looked angry. Jared didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flash grenade from his belt and hurled it at the creature's feet. The explosion of white light filled the street. The hunter screeched in agony. Jared and Lyrian didn't wait to see what happened next. They ran. Straight into the darkness of the tunnel. The darkness swallowed them whole. Jared and Lyrian stumbled down the tunnel, their breaths ragged, their footsteps echoing through the damp underground passage. The only light came from the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi clinging to the cracked walls. Behind them, the city still burned. And somewhere above them, the hunter screamed. Jared knew better than to think the grenade had killed it. It was still hunting. Still coming. And now, they were trapped in its maze. Lyrian shivered. Her arms wrapped around herself, and her violet eyes darted across the tunnel walls. Jared exhaled, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Keep moving," he murmured. "We need distance." She nodded but didn't speak. She hadn't said a word since the hunter nearly ripped them apart. Jared understood. Fear wasn't the kind that just went away. It stayed in the bones, clung to the skin like smoke. But fear wouldn't save them now. Jared's voice softened. "You did good back there." Lyrian glanced at him, surprised. "You saved my ass," he continued. "Twice." A flicker of emotion passed across her face. Maybe pride. Maybe disbelief. Then she just kept walking. Something dripped from the ceiling. Jared stopped. The air smelled wrong. Lyrian paused beside him, eyes wide. A few feet ahead, the tunnel split into 3 different paths. Jared's gut tightened. A trap. The Tark'eth were smart. Smarter than most gave them credit for. They didn't just hunt with claws and brute force. They set traps. They guided prey where they wanted them to go. And right now, Jared had a sickening feeling that they weren't alone down here. Then came the first sound. A faint click. Not from behind. From up ahead. Lyrian tensed. Jared silently raised his rifle. The glow from the fungi barely lit the tunnels, but something moved in the shadows. Something low to the ground. Then, a pair of yellow eyes snapped open. Jared didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot lit up the tunnel for a split second, and that's when he saw it. A second hunter. Not like the one outside. Smaller. Faster. A tracker. And it wasn't alone. Jared grabbed Lyrian and ran. A second pair of eyes appeared in the next tunnel. Then a third. They were surrounded. The clicking sounds grew louder, bouncing off the walls. Lyrian's breathing was fast, too fast. Panic. Jared knew the feeling. Knew the way terror locked muscles, made people freeze, made them easy prey. He didn't have time for fear. They had seconds. Left. Jared yanked her toward the left tunnel, the narrowest passage. Hunters were big. That meant tight spaces worked against them. Lyrian stumbled but kept moving. The walls closed in, rough stone scraping against Jared's shoulders. Behind them, the trackers hissed. Jared didn't look back. He kept running. Then the tunnel ended. A sheer drop opened before them, a rusted metal platform overlooking an ancient sewer system. Jared cursed. No way forward. No way back. Lyrian turned, eyes filled with panic. The clicking grew closer. Jared clenched his jaw. They had one option. He grabbed Lyrian's arm. She gasped, but before she could react, he jumped. They plummeted into the darkness below. The fall felt endless. Wind rushed past Jared's face, cold and sharp. His fingers tightened around Lyrian's arm as they plummeted into the dark abyss. Then, water. They hit the surface hard, the impact knocking the air from Jared's lungs. Cold liquid swallowed them whole, dragging them down. Jared fought against the current, kicking upwards. His boots felt heavier than they should. His gear threatened to pull him under. His hand slipped, Lyrian. Panic surged through his chest. He reached blindly through the murky depths and grabbed something, her wrist. He yanked hard. They broke the surface together. Lyrian gasped, coughing violently, her pale hands splashing in the black water. Jared sucked in a sharp breath. His body ached. But there was no time for that. The trackers were still up there. And if they didn't drown, they'd be coming down next. The water was moving. Jared forced himself to look around. They had landed in what looked like an ancient underground river, long abandoned, carved by time and decay. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by faint blue moss clinging to the walls. The water moved fast. Too fast. It was sweeping them forward. Lyrian's violet eyes were wide with terror as she struggled to stay afloat. Jared swam to her side, gripping her shoulder. "Hold on to me." She obeyed without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his neck. Then the current pulled them under. The river became a nightmare. Jared barely had time to react before the water sucked them into the darkness. The tunnel narrowed, the speed increasing. They were being dragged deeper. Lyrian clung to him, her grip tight with fear. Jared struggled to keep both their heads above the surface. His arms burned. His breath was ragged. Ahead, he spotted something worse. A massive hole. The river was feeding into it, a vertical drop into the unknown. Jared's mind raced. If they went over, there was no telling what was below. He needed a way out, now. Then, hope. To the right, barely visible in the dim light, was a ledge. It was high. Too high to reach from the water. Jared had one shot. He turned to Lyrian. Hold your breath. Her fingers dug into his soaked jacket, but she nodded. Jared took a deep breath. And kicked off the riverbed with everything he had. The current fought against him. The pull of the drop threatened to tear them apart. Jared's fingers brushed the ledge. And slipped. No. He tried again. This time, Lyrian moved too. She reached up, her smaller hands catching onto the jagged rock. With the last of his strength, Jared pushed her up. She scrambled onto the ledge, gasping. Then, before he could be dragged away, she grabbed his arm. Jared gritted his teeth, kicking against the current. Lyrian pulled. She wasn't strong enough. But she didn't let go. Jared's fingers found a hold. He hauled himself up, collapsing beside her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Just panting. Just alive. But they weren't safe yet. A distant thud. Jared froze. Lyrian's breathing stilled. Above them, something landed. Something big. Jared's heart slammed against his ribs. The hunter had followed them down. The air was too still. Jared didn't move. Neither did Lyrian. But above them, standing on the ledge of the ruined water tunnel, the hunter had arrived. Its silhouette was barely visible in the faint glow of the moss. Tall. Unnatural. Watching. Jared could hear it breathing. A slow, deep inhale through its metallic rebreather, followed by a wet, rattling exhale. Then, a sound he hadn't heard before. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap as its claws drummed against the stone. Jared's stomach tightened. It wasn't just hunting. It was savoring this. Lyrian tensed. Jared barely noticed at first, but something about her changed. The way her fingers clenched against the rock. The way her breath stabilized. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't trembling. Jared turned his head slightly. Lyrian. But she was already moving. She stepped forward. Not away from the hunter. Toward it. Jared's chest tightened. What the hell is she doing? But he didn't stop her. He saw it in her eyes now, she wasn't afraid. She was done running. The hunter noticed. It tilted its head, mandibles clicking. Then it laughed, a low, guttural sound. Mocking. It spoke in broken Standard Galactic. Brave. But useless. Jared gritted his teeth. That was it. No more games. He lunged forward. And so did Lyrian. The hunter didn't expect her. It expected Jared, the soldier, the fighter. Not her. But Lyrian moved first. She dropped low, grabbed a jagged metal pipe from the ground, and swung with everything she had. The sharp edge slammed into the hunter's side, hard. It roared. Jared didn't hesitate. He fired. 1 shot. 2. 3. The first bullet cracked through armor. The second tore through muscle. The third, straight through the head. The hunter staggered. Its limbs twitched. Its claws scraped uselessly against the stone. And then, it collapsed. Silence. Jared's breath came in sharp gasps. Lyrian stood still, the bloodied pipe slipping from her fingers. The hunter didn't move. It wasn't getting up. They had won. Lyrian turned to Jared. Her violet eyes were different now. Not just fear. Not just shock. Something else. Determination. For the first time since the attack began, she stood tall. Jared exhaled, shaking his head with something between relief and disbelief. Then, He smiled. Guess you're not useless after all. Lyrian blinked, then, after a moment, she smiled back. The war wasn't over. The city was still burning. The Tark'eth were still out there. But tonight? Tonight, they survived. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they fought back.